I'm sorry that I could not be with you in person, so I present my digital self. Well, the events that are taking place between the United States, South Korea and North Korea, I think should be treated with a cautious optimism. There are some moves towards peace and possible reunification, which the US under Trump appears to be supporting. But as I'll run through in some detail, the US has quite a consistent and dedicated history of rejecting North Korea peace offers and even violating numerous treaties. This is very different from what we're told in the media. So, as you know, the mainstream tends to portray North Korea as a kind of crazy state living in self-imposed isolation, when in fact if you review the military records, congressional records, what experts on the subject have to say, you find that the opposite is true, that North Korea has been deliberately isolated. So, as you probably know, the general background is that North Korea was a single entity. Korea had been a single entity until the US divided it between North and South between 1945 and 1948. And the reasons appear to be that the United States wanted to make sure that an anti-US government would not come to power. So divide and rule was one of the simpler options. And also the United States sought to prevent the Soviet Union from taking over the whole of Korea. However, the now declassified CIA records state that Stalin had not intended to take over the whole of Korea. So when North Korea invaded South Korea, which triggered the Korean War, again, declassified CIA documents now state that it's very likely that North Korea was responding to South Korea's militarism, which had been bolstered by the United States. The United States supported South Korea as it does today. Well, this led to the Korean War, in which the United States, by its own records, destroyed about 90% of North Korea with carpet bombing, devastating air war. So I mentioned that I'm going to talk about treaty violations. Let's start with the late 1980s. Why is that? Why pick then? Well, according to the right-wing Heritage Foundation, even they say that the United States, to quote them, refused even casual contact with North Korean officials until the early 1990s. In 1990, North Korea said that it would accept inspections from the International Atomic Energy Agency on the condition that the US withdraws its nuclear forces from the region. And in fact, the US stationing nuclear weapons in the region was a violation of the Armistice Treaty from 1953. Obviously, the US refused to do this. So 1992, North Korea and South Korea sign a joint declaration on denuclearization of the peninsula, and this involved joint and mutually agreed inspections of one another's weapons systems. And initially, North Korea lived up to its promises to halt uranium or plutonium reprocessing, and it even allowed IAEA inspectors into the country. Also offered to allow US delegates to come, but the US under Bush the First rejected the offer. Writing in the respected Arms Control Association journal, Leon V. Seagull, who's a specialist of the region, he said, for a country supposedly intent on obtaining nuclear weapons, that's North Korea, North Korea's self-restraint seems difficult to explain. So again, we have this curious phenomena of mainstream media saying that North Korea is a crazy regime out of control and a threat to the West, and yet security experts say the opposite, that it's in the context of what's happening, it was self-restraint, which is a triumph of media propaganda. And Seagull goes on to explain that one of the explanations for North Korea's self-restraint is that it was trying to trade in its weapons program for security guarantees, meaning not being destroyed by the United States. He goes on to say that Washington entered talks, this is early 90s, with extreme reluctance and was unwilling to specify what it would give North Korea in return. And Seagull concludes that when it did make promises, they were not always kept because Washington was dependent on others to fulfill them, although, as we'll see, Washington certainly unilaterally rejected many as well. So under the Clinton administration, now moving into 1994, we had the US-North Korea Agreed Framework, and part of the US obligation was to replace North Korea's graphite reactor with light water plants, but it never did. After the start of the agreed framework, the US helped to establish the Korean Peninsula Energy Development Organization, so now into 1995, and this involved helping to raise money to transport oil to North Korea, which was starved of resources and development, as well as thousands of spent fuel rods from North Korea's Yongbyon reactor to remove them and seal them as part of denuclearization, but the US never lived up to its obligations and failed to help dismantle the reactors to replace them with light water ones. And this continued until 98. Finally, North Korea fired a long-range missile over Japan, and according to the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, this move by North Korea was actually designed to force the US to negotiate, and unfortunately that's a case of threats actually working. So the US did return to the negotiating table. This is now year 2000. However, within a year, George Bush II was in power, and many of you will remember his famous Axis of Evil speech, in which he included North Korea as part of the Axis of Evil. Scholars at the Woodrow Wilson Center say that, to quote them, the US had boxed itself and North Korea into a corner by referring to North Korea as evil. So a year later, 2002, the US initiated the Proliferation Security Initiative with allies in the region. However, but by the end of the year, the Assistant Secretary of State, James Kelly, had made allegations that North Korea confessed to him that they were building an illegal uranium enrichment weapons program, but North Korea denied ever saying such a thing or having such a program, and as a result of this, Bush II suspended the oil transports which he was obliged to transport under the agreed framework. So by 2003, North Korea announced its intention to withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Now, states join that. They sign on to that treaty with the understanding that they can develop nuclear materials for civilian but not military use. So by withdrawing from it, North Korea signalled that it was going to start developing nuclear weapons. And the US then requested that China, which was the main and remains the main ally of North Korea, take a role in mediating the discussions. And so the Bush administration, Bush II, entered into talks with China, and North Korea was persuaded by China to enter these talks. North Korea, in fact, requested direct bilateral talks with the US, but the US rejected this. And at one of the trilateral talks mediated by China, the Bush administration decided to reject North Korea's offer to freeze nuclear development in exchange for economic assistance and more security guarantees. Again, security guarantees means not being destroyed by the US, but also they wanted guarantees from US allies Japan, which hosts US military bases, and South Korea, which regularly holds joint exercises. So at the meetings, the Bush administration says the military option is on the table and not off the table, which appeared to confuse the Korean and Chinese-speaking delegates who said, well, where is it then? Well, this playing games, did eventually result in the three-party talks, 2003, in which North Korea agreed to denuclearize on terms acceptable to it, meaning that the US won't attack it. The three-party talks became the six-party talks when Russia, South Korea and Japan joined, but these failed for several reasons. The first and second joint statement of the talks, 2005, Bush prohibited US delegates from negotiating bilaterally with North Korea, so North Korea responded by withdrawing from the talks. The third joint statement was held, and South Korea agreed not to develop nuclear weapons, and North Korea agreed to abandon its nuclear weapons program. But by September, the US decided to sanction North Korea, particularly banks that were doing business with North Korea, and North Korea responded by boycotting the talks. So this is clearly a pattern of every time there are moves towards peace or denuclearization, the US finds a way of sabotaging it. The US responded to the boycott by sanctioning North Korea directly and also accusing the country of being a state sponsor of terrorism and freezing millions of dollars of assets. So North Korea responded by reverting to its nuclear weapons and ballistic missile development program. At the six-party talks in late 2006 and early 2007, North Korea agreed to the initial actions for the implementation of the joint statement, and this plan outlined closing North Korea's nuclear facilities in Yongbyon and abandoning future programs. In exchange, the Bush administration was supposed to remove North Korea from the list of state sponsors of terrorism. But by February 2007, North Korea's vice foreign minister was actually meeting with Bush administration officials, and this was the first time that relations had been so warm between the countries. And one of North Korea's prerequisites for denuclearization was ending the US embargo, which was quite crippling. But the US never did, and continued to freeze North Korea's foreign assets. North Korea did allow UN inspectors into the country, and the US did supply some oil, as it was obliged to do. But by the beginning of 2008, the reciprocation had declined, so the remaining oil that was promised never arrived, and new equipment for power plants never came. But despite this, North Korea did achieve 75% of its denuclearization, and in June 2008, North Korea agreed to provide reports to the US concerning its plutonium production. But the US didn't accept these reports. It demanded detailed explanations of certain elements. And so North Korea reacted in kind and expelled the UN weapons inspectors. Now notice in the media you don't hear all this background, you just hear headlines like North Korea expels UN weapons inspectors. Well, the US by June 2008 had briefly lifted sanctions, but this time it was Japan refusing to oblige the six-party talks. And when the US Assistant Secretary of State Christopher Hill visited North Korea, North Korea signalled willingness to reinstate the inspectors. But by then we move into the Obama era, and this time it was Obama scoring points at home by presenting North Korea as the boogeyman of Asia. So March 2009, 2 US journalists were caught operating in North Korea near the border with China without a permit. In April, North Korea said it was going to launch a satellite, which the US claimed was actually part of a missile test. And North Korea, because the hardline President Lee in South Korea was elected, North Korea withdrew from the six-party talks. And then in May, North Korea launched a second nuclear test. So the US led sanctions on North Korea, and so North Korea decided to, fortunately this time China was able to mediate and convince North Korea to rejoin the talks. So by 2010 you have North Korea agreeing to a peace treaty with the US, including denuclearization, again on conditions that sanctions are removed. But the US, and this is under Obama, refused North Korea's offer and conditioned the talks on sanctions remaining. That's another theme. We often hear talks based on preconditions, which render negotiations useless. Well, tensions mounted again in March 2010 when a South Korean ship exploded and sank, and North Korea was blamed for it, even though they denied responsibility. In April, according to the US-based Nuclear Threat Initiative, North Korea, quote, renewed its calls for a peace treaty and released a memorandum stating that it would limit the number of nuclear weapons produced and rejoin denuclearization efforts if the US formally recognized it as a nuclear weapons state. But the US rejected the offer. And so it goes on to today. Now the message that the US is giving is very mixed under Trump. So in February it was alleged that Trump's Vice President Mike Pence had refused to applaud at the Olympic Games when the South Korean and North Korean delegates brought out a flag showing a picture of a unified Korea. This was really unprecedented given the hostilities between the two countries. So this signalled that the US wasn't interested in reunification. And at the same time, the US Secretary of State Tillerson, who, as you know, was fired, he told CNN that preconditions remain, namely North Korea has to denuclearize. But we now know that behind the scenes, Tillerson's replacement, Mike Pompeo, former CIA director, had actually been meeting with the leaders in North Korea. And this followed Kim Jong-un's call for negotiations with Trump. So tomorrow, I guess by the time you see this, the North Korean and South Korean leaders will be meeting to discuss moves toward peace and possible reunification. This will be only the third meeting between the two since 1953. So the US involvement, the support given by the US is surprising, given the hawkishness of the administration. Um, well, we don't know if the talks will work or whether it will. And then next month, North Korea is supposed to be meeting the US directly, US leaders directly. So we don't know if this will work or whether it will end up being, as the track record that I've just run through, whether it will be US rejection. But I think it's up to people like us, activists, peace groups, anti-war groups, to put pressure on our leaders to make sure that they turn their rhetoric into reality. And it's much easier for people like us, or Americans, Japanese, South Koreans, to engage in activism than it is for North Koreans or other people living under more direct forms of tyranny. So to conclude, I said at the beginning that I might mention why the US appears to be supporting these moves toward peace. We can only speculate, but of course it's possible that a unified Korea could be a weapon against China, which is America's main enemy in the region. And it's also worth noting that over the last few years, North Korea has implemented very mild neoliberal reforms, as South Korea had done in the late 1990s. So it's possible that the US wants to turn a united Korea into another neoliberal kind of weapon to force China to further its own neoliberalism, but again, that's speculation. So yes, if you have any questions, I'm sure you can get my email address from Pete, and thank you.